something we have to deal with every single day in our work is the decisions we make. So I want to think about decisions. So, well, it's fairly early in the morning. Raise your hand if you have to make at least one decision already today. The hardest part was waking up, wasn't it? I know it. And your mind says otherwise, your body says completely different. But you took the step, you woke up, you dragged yourselves here. It's great to have you. But decisions are something we make every single day. But a lot of times when we think about decisions, we think about them as these switches. I'm going to do this or not. I want this or I don't. And we need to use this framework or not. And a lot of times we tend to sometimes begin to think about decisions as these binaries where we turn on a switch or turn it off, and we tend to really make these decisions. And even worse, we tend to make some decisions and then want to cling on to it. And if you ask me, there are two words in English I hate the most, and those are called the words best practices. Because best practices usually means we decided these bunch of stuff, or somebody else did, even better. We're going to check off those check boxes. I don't need to think. And if it doesn't work, I have somebody else to blame for it. Well, but we need to really go beyond that in how we think about decisions. But decisions are really hard. And we get tangled up. We go into this analysis paralysis. And to make things worse in making decisions, we bring not only the things we need to decide about, but we carry our emotions with it. And when we carry our emotions with it, these decisions become really, really hard. But as it turns out, part of what really makes decision hard is also where you are. So a lot of times, somebody may be able to make a better decision than us, or vice versa, depending on where we are. And sometimes we are stuck in that maze and trying to really figure out how to make this transition can be really intimidating. So sometimes we have to focus not on what we are deciding, but on the environment that we are currently in for us to be able to make those decisions. So with that said, we want to really think about what is one of the very first steps in making a decision. And I would say very fundamentally that comes down to the will to change our decisions. Not just to decide, but the will to change decisions. This is usually a good thing to have in meetings and discussions to ask people, are we open for consideration to change? Because if people are stuck on what they have decided, you can speak all day you want, but you won't be able to move the needle because they are determined to stick with what they have decided. So the question you want to ask is, do you have the will to change? But one of the things that we can learn from is quite a few things outside of our own field. And during the pandemic, I decided that my wife and I decided we want to build a house. And building a house is an enormously expensive and risky endeavor, as we know. And as we started building this house, and anytime I would tell somebody we are building a custom house or a semi-custom house, literally their response would be, we're very sorry to hear that. And I would freak out, like, oh my gosh, why do you say that? And they would say, well, the last time we built a house, the builder ripped us up, and we lost a lot of money on it, so it's a nervous thing. And that's about time when I tweeted this, and I said, those who compare building construction to software development understand neither one of them. And a lot of times when people compare building construction and software development, either we tend to say that, oh, things are decided so much in advance in building construction. And I found a builder who completely disproved all those myths, and it was an amazing experience. And just to give you one example of it, when I wanted to build a house, we were talking about, where to place the house. And there was a certain direction that we wanted to place the house. And I worked with an architect. I'm talking about the real architect now, not the software architect. And the architect and I worked with each other, pretty closely. We came up with the plan of the house. And this was, I have to say, one of the best architects I've ever interacted with, amazing person, and his ability to even kind of read my mind, or at least so it felt. I would talk about, well, here's a room I'm thinking, and he would draw a sketch and say, is this kind of what you want? I'm like, how do you know this? How can you read my mind? And so it was extremely good. But one problem we ran into was, when he designed the house, he said, we need to have 3 steps to get into the house. And I remember spending time with him and saying, well, you're putting 3 steps to go into the house, but, I've got parents living with me, and mom and dad, it's easier for them to walk in rather than climb the steps. I'm not going to be in all the time. What if I need to drive a wheelchair? Can you remove those steps? Oh, no, you cannot do it. And here's the reason for it. And he's giving me all these reasons. There is code and you have to follow these. Hey, can you put a ramp in the garage so we can push a wheelchair in? No, you cannot put a ramp in the garage because you need a certain slope, you don't have enough space, and there's city and code and all that. So we went through all of this over and over and over. And a few months goes by, and literally, I'm not even exaggerating here, at 6:30 in the morning, my wife gets a call from this guy, whose name is David Hammer, and Dave says, hey, calls my wife and says, hey, we're here to dig the foundation hole. So all these bulldozers are here, and they're going to be digging up the hole. And my wife said, well, thanks for calling, but Venkat and I are busy today. We will not be able to come over there, but I'm glad you guys are on the site. Take care of it. They're like, yeah, but the reason I called you is, would you like a zero entry? And she's like, what's a zero entry? Well, you can just walk into the house without any steps. And she said, well, thanks for asking, but Venkat spent a lot of time with the architect, and he said you cannot do this. And Dave said, I'm not asking you what the architect said, I'm asking you, do you want it? This is the programmer's telling you, right? Don't do what the architect, right? What do you want us to do? And she's like, are you serious? You can do this? Like, no promises, but I just want to know if that's what you wanted. And she's like, yeah, definitely we want it. He's like, I'll call you back. And, 3 p.m. he calls back and says, you need to review all these documents and sign off on this before you go forward. And we're looking at it, and the entire elevation of the house is changed. And I called him and said, what just happened? He's like, oh, I called the architect, and I told him how we can actually do this. And this just blew my mind. And just think about this for a minute. They're there to dig the hole, and what's the easiest thing for him to do is to say, look, the architect designed this, I'm going to build it, I don't want to spend any money, any time, any effort, my job is done. But every step through the process, he would call me and say, well, this is what you wanted, here are the options, which one do you want? And one day I went to him and said, I got a question for you, why do you do this? And he said, well, it's very simple, I built this once, but you're going to be living there for a long time, so I need to build it for you, not for my convenience. And I thought to myself, what a novel idea. I go to my programmers and I say, hey, and they're like, oh my gosh, I already wrote the code. I don't want to change it anymore. And that will to change is unbelievable. And this is what we end up with eventually, where we don't have any steps to go into the house. You can just walk in, and it's pretty amazing how they can change things in what we consider to be so, decided upfront. That's not actually true. But of course, it doesn't mean I can walk in and change things anytime I want to change everything. But there's a lot of things that are willing to change as well, and we don't really think about it as much. So that's the very first step, is the will to change. But of course, I think we all can collectively agree that some decisions are highly critical, right? Like what? For example, this one. Do you use over-orientation or under-orientation? And just out of a curiosity, raise your hand. How many of you use or prefer over-orientation? Okay, a few hands goes up. Interesting. How many of you prefer under-orientation? A few less. And I'm really surprised at the fewer hands that going up. Well, actually, in this case, when I ask this around the world, majority would say the over-orientation. In fact, some people are so adamant that's the only right way to do things. In fact, I was curious, and I thought to myself, well, this is the decision we have to make. And I started really doing some searching on the web, and I came across this, which is even more scary. It is an article that said the correct way to hang the toilet paper according to science. But then it went on to say, hanging it the wrong way can result in absenteeism, workers' compensation payments, and even lawsuits. Can you imagine? You get sued because you put that in the wrong direction. Now my mind is corrupt. Every time I go to the bathroom, I got to check which way it's hanging. And it turns out it cannot be just this binary decision, one is right, the other is wrong. And I started noticing, in the airplanes, guess what? It usually ends up being the underhang, if you will, and so the airplanes usually use underhang. Then I looked at lounges. Then I started researching, why would anybody do this? And then people, were talking about, if you have pets at home, if you have really small children at home, can you imagine having a child at home and the entire house is filled with paper towel because a kid decided to drag it along and have some fun with it? Well, so there are times when maybe one is better than the other, and as much as scary this particular verdict is, there are times we have to decide differently as well. So then, of course, the question then is, when we start considering the consequences and the pros and cons, we think about decisions a little bit differently. But as it turns out, very few things in life are these binary choices. You just don't say, here's the right thing and that's the wrong thing. And there are times we have to really think a little bit more about this. And let's think about a few things just in life before we talk about programming. Now, let's think about this for a minute. Is ego good or bad? And I'm sure people will advise us and tell us, oh, you shouldn't have ego. But here's the problem. Imagine what happens if you have zero ego. You would not even be able to get off your bed in the morning, because lack of total ego usually ends up meaning low confidence. You don't have any confidence in anything you do. And if somebody says, what do you think? I don't know. What should we do this? I don't know. And we don't want to commit to anything because we don't have any confidence at all. Now, on the other hand, what if somebody is very egoistic, enormously egoistic, to the level of being even narcissistic? Well, that will be overconfidence. That cannot be good. So now the question is, should we have ego or not? And the answer is yes, you do, because lack of it is dangerous as much as having too much of it. You probably want to really strike the balance in between, where you can have enough so that you can have self-confidence. So that's basically, what we want to do. So we don't want to get rid of it, but don't go overboard with it. But a lot of things, again, tend to really move in this direction. For example, if I were to ask you, how are you? In fact, let's do this little experiment. Go ahead and turn to your left. Go ahead and ask to the person to the left. Ask them, how are you? Go on. What did you hear? What you didn't hear terrible, right? The person next to me, oh, terrible. That would be really, really bad, right? I was teaching a course in Sweden a few weeks ago, and they decided to have fun with me. And the people in the room, as I walked in, they said, how are you? And I said, great, fantastic. And they all kind of laughed for a few minutes. And I said, is something funny? And they said, oh, we just wanted to just hear your response. I said, how are you? And they said, well, that's a cultural difference, they said. Because if you turned around and asked, did the person next to you say awesome or fantastic? You just found the American in the room. Because we never get low excitement. You ask me how you, oh my God, amazing, it's awesome. And we'll just exaggerate to the maximum we can. Why say anything otherwise? Well, my Swedish friend said they never say those words. And I said, what would you say? And they said, they're okay. Meaning, it's not too bad. It's not too great. Life is just in balance. And I thought how amazing it is. Not for me though, right? But that's the way they want to have a balance, strike a balance, never go overboard one way or the other, is a nice idea to have. Now, should I be a pessimist or should I be an optimist? Well, some of us are very pessimistic. You talk to them and they suck your life out within minutes. And you're like, oh my gosh, why didn't they even ask this person? And somebody is so optimistic their feet is not even on the ground. And which one is right? Well, I actually came across this recently about an optimist and a pessimist walking to a bar. And I thought that would be a good combination, right? And so the bartender asked the question, how are things? And the pessimist said, it cannot get any worse. And the optimist said, yes, it can. So, again, it's a balance, right? Which way we go, what's a balance we should strike? If you're optimistic, that's great, but you could be really blind to reality. If you're pessimistic, suspicion is a good thing, but that could drag us down. We want to be somewhere in between so that we are reasonably optimistic, but not overly optimistic, and similarly in the pessimism scale. So, next question, should I say yes or should I say no? I've got a son who graduated from college. He went to the workforce. I was talking to him the other day, and he said, Dad, I'm at work, and they told me I can do this and do this and do this. And I said, yes, yes, and more yes. I said, my goodness, if you keep saying yes, how does it work? He said, this is great. I can do all of these things. And I was wondering, is he right? Is he wrong? Should we say yes? Should we say no? And what's the right answer? And I'm going to say, the more yes you say, the less you will deliver. And the person who keeps saying yes is a person who's dangerous. Because they say yes to everything, they don't remember anything what they said yes to, and they don't deliver any results, and people are chasing behind them, and that's not a great thing. So I often say, quit saying yes. But my son is like, but Dad, I got to say yes to all these people who are giving me these opportunities. So then I started realizing maybe there is a balance here to strike. If you're a novice, you just graduated from school. Oh, by the way, novice doesn't mean you are young or you are new to work. Somebody who may have 20 years of experience may be a novice for something they've never done. You could be a good programmer. You may be a novice for being an architect. You may be a great architect. You may be a novice to become a technical manager. So it doesn't have to be young and green. It's something you're not really at the expert level. But if you're a novice, what do you want as a novice? You want to gain experience. That's extremely important as a novice. I want all these rewarding experiences I can build my portfolio and my resume with. You need opportunities as a novice. But what do you need as an expert? And as an expert, you don't need as many opportunities because you've gained that opportunities already to turn you into an expert. But what you would want is you really are keen on succeeding. And you also really care about your reputation because you cannot remain an expert if you don't deliver on what you take. So now all of a sudden we think about this and say, should I say yes or a no? And I'm going to say you definitely want to say yes as a novice, but you want to move towards saying no as you become more of an expert. Because you cannot sustain saying yes all the time because you won't be able to deliver. You cannot sustain that kind of pace. And so a lot of times you have to make the decision. When I was very young, if somebody says, do you want to come and speak? I'm like, yes, I want to come and speak. Now I reject about 70% of conferences that invite me. Not because I don't want to go, because I can't go everywhere all the time. So I have to say 70% no, so I can deliver on the other 30% for which I say yes. And that is something you need to really think about. So when my boss comes to me and says, I've got an idea, I'm like, no, right? And not rudely saying no, but yes, you can have an idea, but if I have to deliver on the commitments I've taken, I cannot keep saying yes to you. Let's talk about it again. So, but then I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said something that really jumped out of in my mind. And sometimes people have this, fear that if I say no, oh my gosh, I said no to him or no to her. And how can I say no to him or no to her? It's very important to draw the distinction. You're not saying no to the person, you're saying no to the task. And it's important to word it in a way that comes out very clearly. So you don't say no to the boss, you say, boss, I'm going to say no to the task because here are the priorities we have set up and we cannot achieve the results if we do. And the minute we draw the distinction in the conversation, it removes that fear from us and we are more willing to say no because we're not saying no to the person, we're saying no to the task in this case. So in a sense, I would say, should I say yes or no? Well, say yes more often in the beginning as you need to gain experience, but as time goes on, start saying no more because you want to really deliver your results and you cannot sustain by saying yes. So should I say yes or no? And the answer is, where are you in that line on the x-axis? If you're to the left, say more of yes. If you're to the right, start saying more no. And you need to really balance it out. And so again, it's not like one thing is right, the other thing is wrong. So my son is right for his experience, and I may be right for my experience, but we need to really trade that and decide which makes really good sense. So in that regard, it's really to realize that living is an act of evaluating trade-offs. So every single moment, every single thing we do every single day, we are not really picking things from one to the other. What we are constantly doing is evaluating these trade-offs. The minute we think about these as evaluation of trade-offs, we tend to think about things very differently, and we don't think about things as binary yes or no, and we look at that as a spectrum on which we are making the decisions. Let's think about a few things that really matter in this case. You rarely make decisions in isolation. You don't get to pick this and I'm done. And you always are deciding. And here's the scariest part. What you decide to do often eliminates other things you could be doing or could have done. And so the trade-off is something we have to really think about quite a bit. So rather than thinking about decisions as this switch you flip on and flip off, what if we can think about these as dials that we are working with almost every day? It's like the volume. You are turning the volume high or you're turning the volume low. You're not flipping it on and off. But what if almost every decision is a dial and no longer a switch? We can start thinking about this very differently. For example, this literally is right outside my house. This was a few weeks ago, and we had a lot of snow, and it was extremely cold. In fact, this is one of the coldest winters we have had. I was telling a friend of mine that the temperature started dipping down to minus 30 degrees. And my friend was very curious. He said, minus 30, he said. I said, yes. And he said, is it Fahrenheit or Celsius? I'm like, does it matter? When it is so cold, does it really matter if it's Celsius or Fahrenheit? And I was curious, so I looked up, and I found that minus 40 is the ideal number. Because it's the same in Celsius and Fahrenheit, it's called hell. And that's how it felt. It was extremely cold. And we were like, gosh, what do? We need to keep ourselves warm. So the obvious thing, I've got children in college and work. They decide to come home for holidays. And so they come and visit mom and dad. And mom, dad, it's cold. You're like, yeah, welcome to winter, right? And can we turn up the heat, please? So we have a little heater, and again, it's not a switch, it's a dial, and guess what? I can set it all the way to, and I apologize for my unit of metric, we are not evolved yet, we still use Fahrenheit, the rest of the world has evolved to Celsius, but I'm set to about 60 degrees to 61 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what, about 13 degrees Celsius, give or take. And if you ever come to my house, you will ask, where is Venkat? Write to me, because I'll be wearing 6 pairs of clothes on me to keep myself warm. And it's very comfortable when you wear 6 layers of clothing and keep the temperature at 11 degrees or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And my kids are like, oh my gosh, it's really, really cold. Can you turn up the heat for me, please? Well, if I turn up the heat, guess what happens? It gets very comfortable for them. But it gets very uncomfortable for my wallet. And now I spend more money on energy bills, and I'm not having fun. So I gave a really good idea to them. We'll turn up the volume, but here's the electric bill in case you want to share paying for it. And they're like, where's those clothes you kept for me to wear? Immediately the decisions really become different, isn't it? So the idea really is that when you look at this decision, what temperature should I keep the temperature of the house at? And the answer is, well, let's keep it cold enough so we don't get warm enough so we don't get sick, but let's keep it cold enough so we don't really spend too much money on energy. So now we're not deciding warm or cold, we're deciding a balance between spending the money to a reasonable level and setting the temperature so it doesn't get too overly uncomfortable or unhealthy. So once again, decisions are made based on not just the weather alone, but the wallet as well. So we have to really make a decision based on that. Similarly, I get my salary, hey, this is great, I got some money, I want to go buy all of these things I want to buy. Well, what's the point in making money if you're not going to go buy things and enjoy your life? Well, as it turns out, about 40% or even less than that of Americans are really ready for retirement. They don't have enough money saved, so they have to work late in their lives to support themselves. Well, now you start thinking, wait a second though, if I spend money, I have less to save. If I save money, I have less to spend. What should I do now? And now we are asking the question, should I save more or should I spend more? And realistically speaking, there are some months I spend more, there are some months I spend less, so I can save more, but you want to ask the question, in the long term, are you going to be able to reach your objective? That's the question. So the more we spend, the less we save, the less we spend, hopefully the more we save. And the point is, again, which is the right balance to strike? And that's, again, a decision dial. When I was young, I was the over-saver, not the overspender. As I'm getting older, I'm spending more because I don't need to save as much. But that, again, which is right? It depends on your life, your situation, but the question is, are we thinking about it? Because if we don't, there's a very high risk towards it. So this really comes down to something we can relate this a lot. When we think about decisions we make, there are things you decide based on what is happening today, what is happening tomorrow. How many times you tell somebody, call them and say, I'm not going to come to this meeting today because I've got a bug to fix. I'm not coming to this meeting because I've got to take care of this particular design issue. Whatever that could be. I'm not saying those things are not important. But imagine what happens when you wake up in the morning and the first thing on your mind is the soccer issue that you have to deal with. And so you tell yourselves, you know what, I don't have time to exercise today. I don't have time to eat properly today because I got work to do. That's perfectly fine when it happens one day. But when the one day becomes 1 week and the 1 week becomes 1 month and 1 month becomes a few years, what just happened? You are living from crisis to crisis to crisis every day, and in the time you completely compromised your health, and when you are 55, 60, and you're not able to move around as fluidly as you want to, it will be too late really to recapture those health that you lost. So a lot of times our mind is focused on the short term. Hey, as a project manager, I want this release to be done right now. Well, I can release this, but what if there is more bugs to deal with? And you're going to spend the next 7 months fixing bugs. I don't care. I got to release it now. So we tend to really focus on the short term. So we do this local optimization a lot more, and we tend to forget this global optimization. But at the constant time, we got to keep asking this question. How am I doing now, but how am I doing in the long run? Am I going to succeed as a company? Am I going to succeed as a team? Or am I going to succeed as my own project release, and then everything else fails after that? So this really comes down to the Toyota way of thinking from back in time. There was a time, this was decades ago, and when Toyota was focused on building cars as quickly as possible and as cheaply as possible. And when they did, that yellow line on the left side was their manufacturing cost. And the red line on the left side were their maintenance cost. So when you look at them as an organization, what you're noticing here is that they were spending, that much amount of money on manufacturing, but as a company, they were spending that much money overall. And then they started looking at this and said, wait a second, let's rethink about it. Let's increase our manufacturing rigor. We will put in better quality in what we do. We'll take more effort in manufacturing. And so if you only look at the manufacturing cost, you'll freak out. My gosh, you're spending more. But what they found was, by doing so, they were spending a lot less on the maintenance cost. Now, when you look at this as an organization, you are saving a lot more money now thinking about this globally, as in, I don't want to just think about this particular, cost center. What does it mean to me as an organization? You tend to really think about this differently. This kind of goes into their first, a principle as they talk about, where they are saying, base your management decision on a long-term philosophy, even at the expense of short-term financial goals. And this is something I think we can benefit quite a bit thinking every day. Because when you have that impulse to decide right now, oh my gosh, I got to go to this meeting, I got to fix this bug, I got to solve this problem. And then as a result, I'm going to compromise on a lot of these other things. Ask yourself the question, how many times have I compromised that this week, this month, this year? And if you're doing it too often, you are trading your short-term gains for a long-term loss. What fun is that, to ask the question? So survive in the short term, but succeed in the long term. You never want to lose sight of the long-term success in order for you to gain a short-term success. So I want to survive in the short term. I don't want to get fired today, right? I don't want to face an embarrassment from my customers today. That's a survival. But my success is more long-term, not a short-term. Because I want to come winning in the long term, not just winning in the short term. Once we think about these as short-term versus long-term, we make the decisions very differently. And you say, yeah, that's a bug, but I don't want to rush to fix it. I want to take the time to understand the details, and I want to understand the consequences of what I'm going to fix, and maybe you start thinking very differently. So one of the key things to really think about is this act of sustainability. Can I sustain the pace of what I do in the long term to be successful? So as I said, living is an act of evaluating trade-offs. And guess what? Programming is how a lot of us make our living. So a lot of these things matter in what we do in our lives, but they also matter what we do in software development as well. They don't tend to live in isolation. So with that said, let's think about the evolution of software development. When it comes to developing software, a lot of companies did the so-called waterfall approach. Now, would you put that on your resume? Would you say, I specialize in waterfall development? What would you say? I'm agile, isn't it? Why? Because it feels good. Not because it's the truth, right? When I go to companies, I say, hey, how is it going? Venkat, we want you to know we're doing agile. I'm like, I'm so glad we got it out of the way. Now let's talk about what you do. And what they're doing is waterfall, but they call it agile. Because this is so much better to say, right? So we put this on the resume very differently. But what is wrong with waterfall development? Oh my gosh, we should never do this. Like, why? What's wrong with waterfall? Anyone? What's wrong with it? But that's not the reality, though, right? Most stuff is never done. So what's the problem with waterfall approach? Bingo. It's a slow feedback. That's the key, isn't it? If this is the timeline, you start a development and you spend your time in requirements analysis. You spend your time in designing. You spend all this time trying to be thorough about what you're doing. And then you're like, we're down in the schedule, but now let's write code. And when you write code, what do? You compile it, hopefully, right? Depends on the language. When you compile it, what can you do? You run it. And when you run it, what do? You can complain about it. You look at it and say, oh my goodness, software has the observer effect. And the minute you observe something, you want to change it. The problem is, all this time, we had things we did, but they were not in the form where we can start providing meaningful feedback. The minute you start writing code and running code, you got the feedback loop coming in. You show to your customers, you show to your testers, you show to your business analysts, and they're like, look at what we did. They're like, well, let me tell you what we should really do. They're like, are you kidding me? So this moment in time, what is that called? It's called a moment of panic. Because you look at the schedule and say, wait a minute, we're close to the deadline, and now they're telling us we need to change all of this. When you are panicky, what happens? Your mind doesn't think properly. When your mind doesn't think properly, what do? You create more mess. When you create more mess, what happens? You become more panicky. This is a vicious cycle, right? You feed off this panic and you do poor quality work because you're panicky. It leads to more panic. It's a disaster. So the problem really is that the feedback comes in too late in the game. But what is really agile development? So in agile development, in waterfall, we did a lot of upfront design and upfront planning. Well, that didn't work. So what are we doing in agile development? This is the beauty of agile development, right? Hey, we're agile. What does that mean? No design. Let's just get to coding. How does this work? Don't worry about it. We are agile. We'll figure it out. What are the requirements? Don't worry about it. We are agile. We'll figure it out. What do the customers want? Don't worry about it. We are agile. We'll figure it out. What's that called? Disaster. And the customers are sitting there and scratching their head. Is that what agile is? You don't have a clue. When will you? Hey, can you give me an estimate? We don't do this in agile development, right? Estimates are for whims. We don't do this. Well, what if instead of saying no design, what if we do just enough upfront design? So in planned design did not work really well. What's the problem in planned design? The feedback loop didn't exist. You can do all the planning you want. The word plan is an amazing word. The word plan is both a noun and a verb. As a noun, the word plan is useless. As a verb, the word plan is amazingly useful. And in fact, it is so important in agile development, we are supposed to do what's called adaptive planning. So we keep planning and adapting our plan continuously. So the plan design didn't work for us. The other one is emergent design, also known as a disaster. How do you solve it? Let's do it this way. And then about 2 weeks later, let's do it this way. And suddenly we have something that doesn't fit together, doesn't work. And now we need to spend 3 more months fixing this code. That's a disaster. What we want to practice is enough upfront design and an evolutionary design. That's a balance we have to strike. And that is for us to really direct the team towards really being able to afford that in what we do. Likewise, when I started programming decades ago, I was programming predominantly in languages like C++, Java, C#, and so on. And as time went on, I honestly was extremely fearful of programming in languages that were dynamically typed. I would fear programming in JavaScript or with Python or Ruby and so on. And as time went on, I was trying to understand, why am I so happy to program in statically typed languages like Java and C# and C++ and Scala and so on? Why am I so fearful of programming in languages like JavaScript and Ruby? And the answer really is, when most of us would really want a guardrail. If I ask you to drive, and if I tell you you're going to drive on a highway where there is a 2,000 feet drop on both sides, you're going to freak out. You're going to say, my gosh, I don't know if I can drive on this road. But if I give you a guardrail, everyone knows a guardrail is not going to stop you if you go really fast and jump over it, right? That's just a one stop before the death, plunge to the death. But your mind plays a trick on you, isn't it? There's a guardrail, and you're like, I can happily drive on this road. Why? Because there's a guardrail. How many of us have hit the guardrail actually? Don't even raise your hand for that question, right? So you shouldn't have. But the point really is, having that makes a difference. So a compiler is a guardrail for us. But what about these languages for a dynamic type? I'm freaked out. No! That's like you telling me to drive on this highway with no guardrails. But then I started embracing test-driven development. I started writing automated tests. And all of a sudden, I spend more time programming in these dynamic type languages. I've actually released more production systems in dynamic type languages over the years. But why? Because I found my guardrail. And whereas there's no compilers to support me, I have automated tests to give me that feedback loop. So essentially, which of these is the right way to do? The short answer is neither one. But what these provide for you is a statically typed language gives you this concept of design by contract. Design by contract basically says, here is an interface. You can program to that interface. Implementers of that interface abide by the contract to implement it. Now, does it mean your code will never fail when you program with a static type language? The answer is no, that's not true at all. It can fail, and it does fail, but the probability begins to decrease quite a bit. So it's not 100% relief, but it eliminates quite a number of errors on us. But that's a design by contract, which is extremely useful. On the other hand, dynamic type languages give us what's called a design by capability. It doesn't force you to conform to an interface. Some of these languages don't even have interfaces, but hey, if you have these behaviors, then I can make use of these objects. So it's designed by capability. What are you capable of? I don't care about the contract at this time. So when it comes to design by contract, we have the benefits of conformance. We have compilers that do a check for us. We have fewer runtime errors. On the other hand, when you go towards design by capability, you have the ability to write code in a much more flexible way. I'm a big fan of metaprogramming. Metaprogramming gives me the ability to write code that is dynamic and gives me a lot of flexibility. I can, introduce evolvability in my code much more easily. I can create code that's a lot more extensible using these ideas. Now you can ask the question, which one is correct? And the answer is, well, there are times I want what's on the left. There are times I want what's on the left. And I want to be able to go back and forth between them and pick based on what I'm trying to do. So it's kind of like looking at a car, if you will. What if I tell you, I'm going to make a car out of steel? You say, wow, that's a great idea. That'd be really nice. Everything is a steel. Like what? The tires are steel. Everything is a steel. Well, you can't drive a car like that. It doesn't make any sense. Well, a good car needs to have proper amount of spring in it. No, I'm not talking about your framework spring or the weather. It's a spring that you put there to make the experience better when you drive. So there are parts of a car that better be robust, but there are parts that better be flexible as well, and that's very highly critical. So this goes back to an idea of what Vinny calls as a language pyramid. What if you think of your enterprise system as a pyramid where you have a stable layer in the bottom, but you have a dynamic layer on top of that, and you have a domain-specific layer that is on top of that as well. So now your needs of a system are not really static where you say, I want everything on steel, everything has to be this way. You realize there are parts of system where you need the conformance and compliance. There are parts of the system where you want flexibility a lot more as well. That becomes very necessary. So we extend this idea to say, what, for example, if you build the lower parts with Java, maybe upper parts with Ruby or Python, and you create a DSL layer on top of it, and you can vary the languages that you use in these layers, but your intention is very different based on what level you are in your application. So then we don't think about system as binary. We don't say it'll be this and nothing else. We begin to ask the question, what are we trying to do? Where does things fit in? We tend to think about it very differently. Similarly, we often talk about design principles. I cannot tell you how many times I work with programmers and I look at a very complicated code and I ask them, why is this code really written this way? And they say, because we wanted to follow solid principles. Well, how could you follow principles and deliver a really poor quality code? Because the goal there was to follow a principle and we lose sight of why we are doing things. That becomes a problem as well. For example, should I favor reuse? How many of us would say reuse is a good thing? Okay, more people than who wanted to hang the paper towel in one way. That's good, right? So we all say, yeah, reuse is really good. What about coupling? Should I have more coupling or less coupling? What about less coupling? Yeah, absolutely. Now, notice how we contradicted ourselves, right? Because what happens when you increase reuse? You increase coupling. Because if you want to create something reusable, everything has to depend on it. So the coupling went up. And now we are thinking, wait, I wanted both. But you cannot have it, period. So now you have to take your dial. Do I want more reuse? Do I want less coupling? Because you cannot have both at the same time. So should we increase or decrease duplication in code? Same thing. So if you now look at this, you're not looking at them as binary. I want reuse, otherwise get out of the room. I want low coupling. Like, no, these are in odds with each other. And which one is right? What you're trying to do is the question. So if you have low coupling, you have low reuse, which is good and bad at the same time. You have high reuse, but you also have high coupling. And where should I be? Neither extreme may be good. I may have to strike a balance. And when we start looking at these as, I want to spend less money, but I want to live comfortably and not really be in this cold weather, we're asking the balance. Same thing comes here again. Should I increase coupling? Should I decrease coupling? Should I mess with reuse? How do I go with it? So this brings a topic of an insurance company I want to talk about. And I was consulting for this company, and I shouldn't have asked this question, unfortunately. And when I did, I wish the developer said, I won't answer you, but he did. And I asked the question, can I see the database table for this class that you are working with? And he said, sure, and he opens up and shows me the table. That table contained 800 columns in it. And I looked and said, 800 columns. He said, uh-huh. He had no emotion. And I said, this database contains thousands of tables, each with hundreds of columns. Uh-huh. I said, who's using it? He said, everybody. I'm like, everybody who? He said, you understand we have thousands of applications in my enterprise. I said, that's understandable. He says, all of them are using it. Now think about this for a minute. If you ever think about changing the schema, you're going to be in trouble. Right? Because the minute you think you want to change the schema, what's going to happen? So when you enter the company, what are they going to tell you? They're going to tell you, don't screw up. That's what they're going to tell you, right? Hey, I'm at work. Slow down. Walk slowly. Don't screw up. Because if you mess with something, it's a disaster. You probably know this, right? Maybe you're interviewing with this company, and they're telling you, hey, let's go have lunch. We got a great cafeteria. So you go out and have a good food. Everybody's talking, having a good time. Everybody is talking. And then look over, and back in the corner, away from everybody else, there's one person sitting alone, facing the wall, and eating quietly. And you said, who is that person? We said, we don't talk about this person. Like, what happened? And one person says, 3 weeks ago, he tried to change the schema. And he's on timeout, right? And nobody's going to talk to him for 3 months from now. Bad things happen, right? So your goal is to protect it. What went down? You are going to put priority over stability instead of business agility. And in this situation, your business analyst or your customers come to you and say, I've got a request for you to change this. You say, thank you for your request. Yeah, when do you have this? Talk to us in 8 months. 8 months? Dude, you don't understand software development. Right? We try to tell them, let me tell you how software is developed. Well, your business agility just went through out the door because our goal is to stabilize our system because we promoted reuse rather than business agility. It's a trade-off, and we chose one way versus the other. So, simple encapsulation versus reuse. If I give you reuse, what's going to happen? Encapsulation went down the drain. Because in this system I talked about, every system knows about every other system's data by way of database. You have zero encapsulation. You make a change to the schema and you blow everything out of the water right there. So we're not saying duplication is great, so go do it with vengeance, but it's a trade-off. So reduce duplication, but prioritize encapsulation so you can provide better business agility. And so this is a trade-off you have to ask. If you go to your company and you tell them, we want to reduce reuse, they're going to freak out. They're going to say, my goodness, what are you trying to do? This is a very poor way to communicate. Instead you say, hey, what do you want to achieve from the system? We want to be able to effect change. We want to respond to these change. Good, let's focus on that. And how can we achieve that is the question you want to ask. So evaluate trade-offs. And if you ask, what is our job every day? Our job every day is to bring these trade-offs for evaluation. And we have to ask the question, what are we gaining? What are we losing? Should I use imperative style or functional style of programming? Well, there are good things on both sides, isn't it? Imperative style gives me really good raw performance, good exception handling capability. We're all very familiar with it. Functional style is easier to parallelize, reduces accidental complexity, makes it easier to maintain the code, but which one do I choose? And I got to make a decision based on what I'm trying to do in every day. So it's not clear to me when I wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to program it one way or the other. I look at a problem, I look at the outcome I want when I decide it. So do I write imperative style code today? I do. Do I write functional style code today? I do. And you know what's really awesome about it? I have the ability to choose. I don't have to accept what's given to me. I make the decision. Performance and maintainability. Do I want better maintainability? Do I want better performance? And this is an email I get every single week. Every single week somebody will email me and say, but what about performance? And the question is, but what about it? The wrong question to ask is the following, right? Same thing with scalability and performance. You have more scale, you got poorer performance. You got better performance, you got poorer scale. Sometimes you say, look, I achieved both. And you ask the question, what was the cost? It went through the roof. My company is spending millions to achieve that. Well, good luck with that. Does that make sense? It makes sense for the government because they waste our money. It can make sense for a few organizations, but most of us, it doesn't make any sense to do so. So don't ask the question, is the code fast? This is a question I dread because I get this email every week. Hey, the code is not fast. What does fast mean? If I tell you, I want a car that can drive at 200 miles an hour, you're going to ask me the question, what do you plan to drive? Oh, well, of course, here in Bangalore, you're going to laugh. Yeah, you did, right? You say, dude, you want a bicycle, not a car, right? So the question is, you want to ask, is the speed adequate? You never ask the question, is it fast? You always want to ask the question, is it adequate? Is it fast enough for what I want it to do? Because if you ask for the fastest code, you get that and the problems with it. I was sitting in a room, a developer came and sat down with a tub and was angry. He said, I really dislike these people writing code in the next room. They're writing Python code, which is really bad. I said, yeah, you're unhappy with it. He said, Venkat, they're writing that bad code in the name of getting performance. I said, is that really giving performance? He said, that's the problem. It doesn't. Now you got two problems, right? The code doesn't perform, you cannot change it either because it's written so poorly. So you want to ask the question. So end result of worrying about performance is often the worry and not the performance. That is the unfortunate situation we live in. You spend all this time worrying, and what are you left with a worry? Did you get performance? Not really, because that was never really necessary. So we need to really ask this question. And those who sacrifice quality to get performance may actually end up getting neither of them. And that's a choice we have to make very carefully, otherwise we're going to be in trouble. So where performance is truly concerned, write tests for it. That gives us an opportunity to think about what performance really is in that context. So designing and architecting is all about evaluating trade-off. You're not flipping a switch. You are evaluating the trade-offs. You ask the question, what am I gaining? What am I losing? And how can I balance them so I can achieve what I want to achieve is the question. So identify the essential characteristics of your systems. And spend the time asking the question first. What are the things that are important? What are truly the things I need to really focus on? If you don't identify them first, but instead start making decisions, it's going to be a disaster because your focus is in the wrong place. And then prioritize what is really important for you. The worst answer you will get is everything is important. And you got to go back and ask the question, what's really important? Let's talk about it. Not based on our feelings, not based on what I like, based on what the reality of the application is, the context where it's going to be used. And then evaluate the trade-offs of your different characteristics. And ask the question, which do I want more, which do I want less? And don't make binary decisions because they don't really give us the results we want. And decision making, as it turns out, is an optimization problem. That's what we are dealing with. And optimization problems, as you know, don't have one solution. You can pick from multiple solutions, and you got to ask the question, which one can we pick? So decision making is an act of considering compromises, and we need to have these in our discussions. And openly say, let's talk about compromises here, and which one is important, which is less important. And the most important thing to document is the why. Don't waste your time documenting what you're doing, document why you are doing it. And the most sensible answer you can give, you know that already, right? It depends. Because there is no binary answer. Hope that was useful. Thank you.